Alright, so the upcoming reviews are going to be a bit different and I guess you could say unconventional from the way I usually do them, at least for this bunch, because with How to Train Your Dragon 3 I decided to just do this, you know, in the trilogy format, and then I'll also be doing What Men Want in a bit of an unusual way, and then, to my understanding, with Fighting With My Family, it's going to be me, Owen, and Ashley kind of doing like that podcast format we do with the awards videos, and we're all three going to go into that. So in the meantime, I figured I would start with this, and I was initially really nervous to talk about the How to Train Your Dragon trilogy, mainly because I remember vividly when this came out in 2010, and this was a movie where the love and admiration that audiences have for this movie was, like, instantaneous. Like, the day after it came out, I just heard nothing but enormous praise from just about everybody. And even on top of that, also, there's something about the first movie in particular that it sort of has, like, this, I guess, maturity, I guess you could say, associated with it, because at first when you see it, or you at least hear the idea or whatever, you kind of figure it's, like, tailor-made for children. But the thing about this is I talk about all that love and all that admiration this movie has, and most of that I have ever heard comes from adults. Like, I don't know that honestly, I don't know of any children I've ever actually heard praise this movie or even really talk about this movie. It's always adults that are saying just how amazing they think this movie is and how much they love it and how much it affects them emotionally and otherwise. Which really says something, and I've also heard that I guess we're just going to be going into the first movie and then we'll go on. Just sort of abandoning whatever I was about to say there. But, and then it also, I've heard some people credit it with sort of the fascination with Game of Thrones, because when you look at it, this came out, and then it was a little over a year later that Game of Thrones premiered, and it's like this sort of set in that it reinvigorated that fascination with dragons that people have. And then just in time for Game of Thrones to roll around. So it's like, even though in content they're quite different, I know some people have credited it for that, which honestly wouldn't be surprising. So, but the thing that makes me nervous, what I was going to talk about, is the fact that I was never really all that crazy about How to Train Your Dragon. At least not, I mean, I always liked it, like, I thought it was fine, but I was certainly not on the level that a lot of people are in their reaction to it. So in preparation for the third movie coming out, I snagged the first and second one again from the library, because it was like, well, you know, it's been almost a decade since the first movie came out, and I didn't even really remember much. Like, when the second one came out, I did do a review of it, but I think I was pretty passive, and it's like, don't revisit that. So I'll just completely wipe that slate and then see how I feel about it as well before going into the third one. So when I went back into this one, I did notice one thing that probably threw me off immediately about the first movie, because it kind of almost threw me off again this time. And that was this opening scene, where there's a lot to love about the opening scene, for sure. How we're immediately introduced to the world, we've got Hiccup narrating and telling us everything. And the whole thing about how they just sort of... We're already in the middle of battle with all this going on, but it's, like, so almost normal to these characters. Which is... not only does it set up the world, but is kind of funny, too. Where it's like everybody has, like, their little specific job, and they just sort of... It's almost like a routine thing at this point, fighting dragons. But the thing that kind of throws me off about this scene is they throw a lot of information at us at once in, like, this 2 to 3 minute span. Because we've got him telling us his story, him introducing the supporting characters and all of their names, introducing a lot of the dragon types and what they're called and what they look like, and all in the middle of this chaos that's happening, and we have to kind of try to catch everything very quickly as it's coming at us, right as soon as the doors open, like as soon as the movie starts. Which is I mean, a lot to ask of your audience. Obviously, most people didn't seem to care, but most people have also probably seen this multiple times and have now really got the gist of it. But even so, I feel like that's a lot of information to throw out, especially amidst such chaos at the time. So I feel like the information is a lot more useful when we get scenes later when Hiccup's like reading the book and going through all the types where we learn that the Night Furies are like the unholy offspring of lightning and death, stuff like that. So yeah, but I mean at the same time though, you do kind of have to compliment it for getting its exposition out of the way as fast as possible, so they could just get to it. But still, it's a lot of information. A lot. So obviously we do have our main character, Hiccup, voiced by Jay Baruchel, who would not be my first choice to voice a lead character in an animated movie, but there is something about, like, it's one of those cases where his voice is just kind of so synonymous with this character now, just in its tone and his delivery and all that. He kind of has the sort of perfect embodiment anyway. So that just might be me not caring for Jay Baruchel in general, but yeah, I can't admit that he does fit the character for sure. So this is a character that obviously has like the worst luck in the world, because all he wants to do is show his dad that he can kill dragons, that he's capable of that. And it's sort of one of the really appealing things about this movie is the fact that it's like this age-old story, I guess literally. But the thing about it is like it's something you would almost see in a movie, like you could see in a modern movie. It's just the thing that makes this movie and makes it different is the setting. Because you've got, like, the main setup where it's like he's got, you know, I don't want to say animal for dragon, but just for the sake of it, that he finds and he takes care of, and he has to hide because if, you know, his dad found out, then he'd really be in big trouble and something bad would probably happen to it. Like, this is basically the plot of modern movies where a kid finds a dog and has to hide it from his parents. But with the dragon setting, makes it this whole sort of new and fresh thing. And it's like the fact that they make that count as much as they possibly can. And talking about him having the worst luck in the world is now that after all he's wanted is to show his dad that he can do this, now that he's finally given the opportunity, of course he decides, well, I kind of had a personal run-in with the dragon, and I'm kind of thinking I don't want to kill them now. Just when he finally gets the opportunity. As far as the appearance of the movie goes, which I'm sure was a standout for a lot of people, obviously this was at the very height of the 3D craze. This would have been like 3 months after Avatar came out. And it was one of the first movies I remember seeing, like, in 3D, like this, you know, new version following Avatar that they were doing. And it's, the thing about it, though, is, well, I guess the one thing to give it credit for in regards to the 3D is the fact that, once again, when you talk about how people go in sort of thinking this movie's going to be tailor-made for children and all that, is the fact that when you hear about an animated movie in 3D, you kind of immediately think of, you know, using 3D in the really obnoxious way. And I think it surprised a lot of people that this took the immersive route, sort of like what Cameron had intended when he repopularized it with Avatar. And so, but, I mean, I understand that, and I think that's admirable, but I can't really speak much else on that because 3D just kind of never really did anything for me one way or the other. Like, if anything, I thought, like the way the glasses were made everything, like, darker than it was supposed to be, so yeah, but I do like the way they utilized it, like, in, you know, execution, but I still just would watch anything in 2D if the opportunity came, so, and then there's also John Powell's Oscar-nominated score on top of this, which is another huge standout thing I've heard, especially from the big fans of it. And how there's, like, so much different emotion in it, whether it be the moment when he first comes face-to-face with Toothless, or when they're flying around, or when, you know, more emotional scenes happen. Everything just sort of literally hits those right notes. Especially in these flying scenes, which are basically, like, the peak of the movie, where, I mean, and once again, not to hate on Jay Baruchel or anything, but it's like, the real power of these flying scenes is not just what they look like, but the score just working by itself and just being this full-on visual thing with the music accompanying it. So it's like when Hiccup finally shuts the fuck up during these flying scenes is when they really, once again, trying to avoid puns as much as I can, the scenes really take off. But the thing also in regards to sort of a more actiony sense, I mean, if you want to call the flying that, the action scenes themselves, what's really interesting is I'm trying to remember the first time I saw the movie, because if there's one thing that actually does this movie a disservice, it's the sequels. Because when you go back, you see the sequels really sort of took off in the action, and things got really big and even cooler and really elaborate. So when you go back to the first movie, at least for me, by comparison, the action scenes are pretty underwhelming. And pretty, like, sort of abrupt and anticlimactic. Strictly by comparison. I do remember this being, you know, significantly more exciting prior to the sequels coming out. But on top of that, though, you still have, like, these really amazing sets, I guess you call them, with an animated movie. The line blurs on what the actual terminology is. Particularly when you go, like, into the underground layer, where you have, like, the dragon beehive, as they call it, and just these really just great, elaborate pieces of animation for these settings can look really incredible, on top of just the even stuff like the whole training grounds with Craig Ferguson feel really elaborate, and like there's a whole bunch of different things going on. And then just sort of Burke in general, the way it sort of just looks almost like it's sort of stacked on itself is just really amazing. So as far as, I think if there's one thing that's like a downside to this movie, is probably the side characters. How there's too many, and a lot of them don't really do that much, but once again, we've got 2 sequels to sort of iron that out. But here, I don't know, and once again, it's like we're introduced to them so quickly and have to distinguish, like, who's who. Like, I remember Snotlout and Fish Legs, like, might as well have been the same person to me the first couple of times I saw it. Despite the fact that I think it's also that Jonah Hill and Christopher Mintz-Plasse sort of sound alike if you're not thinking about it. But then, and you've got the twins, obviously. But the thing here is that not only do those side characters just not really have a whole lot to do except to be comedy relief and, you know, bumble around the training grounds, but also the whole thing with Astrid, where it's like, we know she's going to be this, you know, romantic interest for Hiccup, because the first thing you think of when you think of Hiccup is this guy needs a love interest. I always thought that was kind of like, I just don't really think that suits the character, but it is a continuous thing throughout. And they do handle it pretty well in the sequels, too, the way they develop it without making it, like, constantly in the foreground. But I do think in regards to the way it's handled in this movie is that I do think, especially since they start off, you know, not like that, and it's just him having that distant crush, I do think when it goes more into, once he starts to basically train himself with Toothless, and then when he goes back to the training grounds and everything, is he handles things differently than he did before. It's almost like there could have been this whole thing going on of him and Astrid being athletic rivals, and that's kind of the way she sees it when he starts getting much better. I feel like they could have done a lot more with that before they started doing the whole love story thing. But it's like, it's only sort of briefly there, and it's really just acting as a bridge for them to fall for each other or whatever. But even so, that's not to say that once it gets there, it doesn't work. Like the way they use the dialogue when, you know, she hits him and says, that's for this, and then she hits him again and says, that's for everything else, and then they bring that back with the kiss. That's really nice. So, there is that. But obviously, the real core of the story is that relationship between Hiccup and Toothless. Because you have the whole thing where it's like, they play it for comedy a lot at the start. The fact that just Stug and Hiccup could not be any more different, despite the fact that Hiccup wants nothing more than, you know, to make him this proud father, and Stug wants nothing more than for Hiccup to be basically the opposite of everything that he is. And the fact that Hiccup feels like so distanced because of that, and just really finds that in Toothless, and how it's this sort of ultimate, really finding his own way and going in the absolute opposite direction. The way all the characters are basically calling him out for being, and it's like the way he basically has to completely embrace that and go in the totally opposite direction, where instead of killing dragons, he becomes best friends with one and becomes inseparable with it. And it just really says something about the whole, basically accepting who you are and not necessarily having to be something that you're told that you have to be and all that. There really is, something moving character-wise in there also. So, yeah, so that's basically what it is. But like I said, they do play that up for comedy at the start, like the whole, I love, Craig Ferguson's line where he's like, oh no, it's not all this, it's what's inside you that he can't stand. And it's like, it's funny at first, and then when you think about it, the more Hiccup kind of becomes this, really sympathetic character, which makes the scenes with Toothless all the more powerful when they come. So, yeah, and once again, I talk about the maturity of the movie. That doesn't mean that it's, feels above being a children's movie at times. Like when you get to something as extreme as Hiccup losing a leg, and you think like, oh, it's really dark and there's maturity to it, but it's also not above being childlike. Like it's not above puns. Like at the beginning when Stoic says, "Are you with me?" If you listen really closely, there's a dude in the back that says, "I have to do my axe returns." Which is a line you'd expect in like a Shrek movie. But still, the fact that it's all sort of still here, but it does manage to make that approach. But like I said, the whole sort of dragons thing has never really been my thing, so I think that's sort of the main reason that this isn't a movie that I like immediately gravitated towards. But I do get it. Like I still don't quite feel, it doesn't have as strong of an impact on me as it does a lot of people. But the fact that I can sort of see it and see why, I guess, is going to have to be enough for me, which is fine. So, that's upon revisitation of a movie I wasn't all that crazy about to begin with, that's where I stand on it now. So, that's how I feel about that. So to move on to the second one, which I did like a lot better the most recent time I saw it than when the first time I saw it. So despite the fact that the movies are 4 years apart, in the story there's actually 5 years that has passed now. And the interesting thing about this is that it's immediately promising because you can tell that from the very opening scene, the second movie knows what the first movie's strengths were. Given that we start off immediately with a big flying scene to kind of also show off how much the world has changed now that humans and dragons coexist. And that's kind of what really works about this, just its opening by itself, is the fact that with a sequel, it's like you either really, really feel like you have to change it up a lot, or you can sort of fall back on what worked before, and in some movies that happens a little too much. And this movie kind of finds a sweet spot right in the middle of that, where, like I said, it feels like the same movie as it opens, but you still have... the entire world feels like it's totally changed in between this time because of the events of the first movie. So, like I said, it still has like the format of the opening of the first movie, complete with the sheep. But instead of in the first movie, when the sheep sort of, were basically bored by the predicament of being attacked by dragons by that point, where you have like the two of them eating and then one gets carried off and the other just resumes eating without even thinking about it. Now the sheep aren't as indifferent because they're being used for the game. But and the whole dragon race and all that, whatever they do, it's like dragon quidditch to them now or something. And yeah, and that just immediately sets it off. But obviously now we're gonna go into the characters that have hopefully developed since the first movie. Obviously Hiccup is a bit stronger, I guess you could say, after not only having been through the climax of the first movie, but also, like I said, losing a limb in the process. but still his relationship with Hiccup, or Toothless, being still as strong as ever, if not more so. And then, obviously, his thing with Astrid is growing stronger, but like I said, really helps that they don't sort of make it as big and crucial and as centered to the story as they could have. It knows, like, that because this does have a lot to do and a lot going on, while having kind of a simple plot at the same time, but especially when a main villain is introduced, but it's sort of what they do with that also. I guess we can go ahead and start with the villain, the main villain, who is this guy, Bloodvist, who is voiced by Jaimin Hounsou. And the really interesting thing about this character is, this character is actually such a big deal, it almost feels like he should have been the villain of the third movie instead of the second. But the thing here is that it ties in a lot of things. There's like, what really helps this movie, I think, a lot is how stoic-driven it is. Because it's about Stoic finding his long-lost love and a villain from his past coming back. And the fact that I didn't even mention when I talked about the first movie, how perfectly cast Gerard Butler is, which, no offense to him, is not something you can say very often. That Gerard Butler just absolutely positively fits this part so much, and only using his voice to go on, just really makes it work. But this thing, when we get like this Bloodvist flashback, not only is this like an incredible scene, and actually sort of has like a sort of creepiness to it, like you can sense the dread in it before anything bad even happens, by just how it has that sort of smoky look to it, and everything's in the darkness, and the way he sort of just walks into the room. And not only does this set up the backstory for that, but it's like, you can just see immediately in this moment how large of a contributor this moment in Stoic's life was to the wisdom that he has now. And it sort of like immediately sort of changes the way you see the character. Like, you could just sort of assume, like, how he got to be who he was in the first movie, but... And you may think, like, you know, losing his wife might have had a lot to do with that. But then when you see this, like, all the pieces feel like they're starting to fall into place, and everything feels like so sort of premeditated in the good sense, in the prepared sense when you're doing a story. And that just really works also. And as far as, like, the character goes and being intimidating, not just intimidating looking, but, like, the moments when when he has, like, you know, the dragon skin, so we just see him engulfed by flames, and he's able to just sort of walk through it like nothing. And Jaimin Hounsou's voice work especially. I mean, not just does his voice suit the character and he can do it well, but nobody, and you can see this in a number of movies, nobody has a battle cry like Jaimin Hounsou. Like, it is so sort of like, you know, blood-chilling in the best possible way. On top of the fact that he's got his own dragon, the Bewilderbeast, I think it is, which is just another thing I didn't touch on in the first movie, was the different designs and looks of the dragons also is worth mentioning. But this one in particular, like, really goes all out with that. Like I said, making them, you know, you can tell which ones are, like, you know, friendly and silly or whatever, and which ones are, like, really intimidating and deadly and all that. So, yeah, this character is a really good addition to it also. But the other thing going on in Stoic's life in this movie is this really sort of beautiful yet unconventional love story in the middle of it. When he is finally reunited with his wife, who's voiced by Cate Blanchett, and Hiccup's mother, obviously, who finds her first. But the thing here is that I also kind of like the intro to where it almost seems like she's going to be a villain also, because she's kind of got that scary mask the first time we see her, and she looks extremely threatening. But then we realize who she actually is, and just the whole scene sort of turns on itself. But the thing here is, when I say unconventional, is this whole idea of, number one, we know that she left them, which may make her seem unsympathetic at first. But then when we realize what her cause is, and when we see that she's basically been this sort of hermit throughout all these years, so it's like she basically doesn't know how to even interact with people at this point. It just sort of really makes her this offbeat character in comparison to the others, which is really saying something, because all the characters are kind of their own thing anyway, but this in particular, she does feel like really, really cast aside in how she's able to basically interact. And the way they handle that, while sort of bringing back the love that seems to have never left the two of them in this moment. And it might seem like I could see somebody looking at it from a more cynical perspective and saying, like, now they've reunited, everything gets really happy really fast, and it's like they're talking about how, oh yes, we're a complete family, we're complete now, we're a happy family. It's like it's just telling you, just right up front, the next scene is going to be tragic. Like, it really basically is the next scene. And I guess I could see it from that cynical perspective, but I really like what they did with this for the most part, and how strong they made the bond between the two of them. Like I said, this, making you fully buy that this couple who have been apart for, like, this long of a period, and for somebody that you could, you know, accuse of abandoning them, it's just sort of this immediate, almost immediate thing, yet somehow it still manages to work because of the way they execute it and how just well it's done, and how well the characters are fleshed out, and exactly how this person would react and feel this way versus what this person would, and it all makes sense to us by the time that it happens, and that's why it works so well. And then we obviously are introducing some more new characters, like Aerith, who's voiced by Kit Harington, which sort of goes in the first movie possibly reinvigorated the excitement before Game of Thrones happened. Would make sense. And the interesting thing about this character also is that we're under the impression that we have another villain. And the thing about that, though, is there is something, you know, I think as soon as we realize how sort of, like, I guess funny this character can be, is sort of when we let our guards down and realize that he's probably not as bad as he seems. He just happens to work with the worst dude possible. And you have those great scenes where, like, Hiccup tries to outsmart him by, like, making himself a prisoner on his boat and all that. I think this is the same scene where they inadvertently play fetch with the dragon, trying to get rid of it, but I do still think that the other side characters that were already here still don't quite have a lot to do. Like, this was, in between the first movie and the second movie, Jonah Hill got 2 Oscar nominations. And the most they can do for his character is make him just hit on Rough Nut, like, all the time. Like, that's just his thing. And that continues on in the third movie, too, with a different character. So that's a lot of the time that still seems like a waste, those 4 that are just kind of hanging out here. I feel like they're trying to do more with Rough Nut as the series goes on, but and work with Kristen Wiig as much as they can, but it's, I don't know, I just don't think those characters are really present enough. But yeah, and then of course, as I was talking about and alluding to, we're eventually going to get to a big tragedy in this movie. And the thing about it, though, is that, yeah, the scene where they reunite does sort of seem like to just lay this out right in front, that this is about to happen. But I think the thing about it, though, is that, number one, when you hear about the death of a parent in an animated movie, you usually expect it to be like a setting off point. Like, it would be something that would be towards the beginning or something that happened off screen or something. You don't really necessarily expect it when you're on your way to the climax. Like, at this point in time, like, if we didn't have the scene before where they were saying, oh, we're so happy to be reunited, nothing's ever going to go wrong ever again, you do sort of, like, Stoic feels safe in this moment. Like, Stoic having made it this far into the movie, and the fact that we're not at the climax, and it's not the beginning of anything, you sort of almost, like, don't even think about that possibility, honestly. And then this happens, but it's not just the tragedy of, you know, Stoic dies. Obviously, it's the fashion in which it happens. Because, once again, the core of the whole trilogy is this inseparable bond between Hiccup and Toothless. And so now that Jaimin has this power to control the minds of all the dragons he basically wishes, or the dragon does, or whatever. It's obviously it is technically Toothless that kills Stuck, which is this ultimate sort of like there's really no way to fault Hiccup no matter how he reacts to this. There's really no reaction here where you say, oh, I don't know if I think Hiccup made the right choice there. This is a point in time where this character, and I think it also works in his development throughout the series also, because I was saying, like, at the beginning of the first movie, you're like, how is this guy ever gonna, be the hero of this story? This little shrimpy kid voiced by Jay Baruchel. And it's just, I think, the gradual nature of being able to train a dragon, then losing a limb in battle, while ultimately saving the day. And then when you get to this point, it's like, by the time this event is going to be over, this Stoic's death by way of Toothless under the control of somebody else, this character has reached a point of no return. It's like, this is like, if this character was going to have all these turning points, this is the ultimate one for sure. And it's like, to have a piece of character development that, with that high of stakes, like, there's the whole thing where, like, yeah, obviously, in a movie like this, if one of the major characters dies, it's going to influence the main character. But to this extent, in the fashion in which it happens, is so sort of unexpected and just really throws you off. Yeah, you just have to admire just exactly how the story managed to get in that direction, and then how it handles it from that point on, especially with this character. So yeah, there's a lot of strong stuff in this. Like I said, the action gets bigger and more elaborate, and in my opinion, more exciting. And a lot of the characters do strengthen, but other characters get, sort of their own storylines that really strengthen the story also. So yeah, and this one is probably, obviously we're about to go into the third movie, but after having seen the third movie, I would say that this one is probably my favorite of the trilogy, is the second one. Like I said, the score is still just as strong as ever in all those aspects, and the animation especially is like just like so incredibly detailed, to the point of how it sort of brings the world itself to life. But yeah, because there is maybe a bit of a distance in regards to DreamWorks and how its animation looks, and how it's not exactly realistic animation to something like what Into the Spider-Verse looked like this year. But just the detail in the world still manages to just make it really, really stand out in this really big way. So I do get the love for this more than I do the first one, but like I said, as a whole continuous story, just together, it just like a very easy puzzle, just fits right together. So that's how I feel about that one. Finally, we reach the finale of the trilogy, also the movie of this weekend. With How to Train Your Dragon: The Hidden World. So, one of the things I forgot to talk about in regards to how the immersive 3D that the first movie used, one of the scenes that I remembered like really standing out to me with that was that scene with the ships being surrounded by the fog and all that, and just sort of that sort of doomy feel that gave. Well, the fog returns for this opening scene with Hiccup and everybody else coming in to rescue these captured dragons. But of course, despite everything the characters have been through, they're in a new position, but they're still the characters that we've come to know. So it's like, even despite the, position the Hiccup has now, still no badassery for him much. There's still, like, he shows up, and he's gonna do his big thing, he's gonna save the dragons, and then there's the whole demon thing, where they mistake him for a demon, and it becomes a comedic scene, and everybody starts bumbling around. But like I said, even though the character feels like maybe, especially after the events of the second movie, he's a bit beyond this, it also kind of makes sense for the character for him to not be, too. So it's like, he's there, but he's still Hiccup, and everybody else is still everybody else. So that's kind of endearing, but also shows where the characters are now. And as this goes on, there is a new dragon that's introduced, which they start calling a light fury because it's toothless, but it's female and it's white. So naturally, that's going to take us in a whole other direction, also. But before that, I do think it's interesting the way how I said the second movie has the same introduction as the first, but it also throws in those differences. The interesting thing about this is in both the first and second movie, we do begin with Hiccup's narration, where he explains to us, when the second movie starts, you almost think it's sort of like the Riddick movies, where we get the same narration at the beginning of every single movie that tells us the exact same things, the same intro and everything. But Hiccup is always sort of also, like, it starts off like it's going to be the same thing, and then the differences start to happen. And this one is pretty much the same way, but instead of it more or less being narration, now it's him talking to the dragons directly as they're all going towards Burr, because obviously they're going to start having an overpopulation problem. And so I thought that was a nice little interesting way to turn that on its head just a little bit. And then once they get there, obviously, the overpopulation problem is like one of the last problems eventually this movie gets to. Because as far as the priority list goes, because you've got, for the more mundane stuff between the characters, you've got the fact that everybody's starting to hint now that he and Astrid need to get married, especially since he's the whole, chief now without Stoic. But the thing about it is, when they set that up, it's like, that could probably get pretty uninteresting, because like I said, the series has been really good about not making that the center of the story. So it's like, maybe with this whole relationship between the two of them, just sort of show its strength. Like, you really don't need to throw that much conflict into it. But thankfully the movie doesn't really treat it that way much. Like, it's a recurring thing throughout the movie, especially with Tough Nut basically giving him, like, relationship advice throughout the movie. But for the most part, it's really just kind of in the background there. So that's something that really could have ruined it if they went a little too far into it. But speaking of that, the really interesting thing about this is you'll notice that there has been a sort of continuous line throughout the movies where in the first movie we did kind of have the growing romance between him and Astrid, especially once it got to the scenes with him flying with her and all that. They had their own little Superman Lois Lane moment. And then in the second movie we have Stoic and Valka reuniting, which was this own beautiful love story in the middle of that movie. So now it's like, Hiccup had his love story, Stoic had his love story, so who's left? So yes, Toothless, it's time for him to get his love story by the time we get to this. Which is nice. It does get, I think, a bit, this is where I think it maybe gets a bit childlike, and you can kind of see the influence to where, like I said, the other movies that have been accused of being made for children, despite the fact that they really don't feel like that. But then at the same time, I heard an argument that Toothless trying to impress her, it comes off in more like, it's sort of like a Charlie Chaplin way, where it's obviously, there's not going to be any dialogue, obviously. And it's just the whole physicality of it all. So yeah, thinking about it that way, I guess I can embrace that. But there's also another thing going on here where we start getting flashbacks to Stoic, and that was the thing was when I saw Gerard Butler's name on the cast list before I saw it, I was like, that seems kind of cheap, because the whole big thing in the second movie was killing him off, and it's like, this is gonna be, it's like, they're gonna somehow cop out and, like, shoehorn him into the movie somehow, so we don't, like, so it's like he's still there, but it's like, even though maybe it'd be more effective if he wasn't there at all, it would show just how absent he is. However, these flashback scenes, when we first see Stoic, you almost kind of forget how hard it hits that this character is not alive now, because when we get these flashbacks, instead of it feeling like, oh, they just wanted to shoehorn Gerard Butler into the movie, oh, they just wanted to put the character in because they just couldn't let it go, they couldn't commit to it. Yeah, the second we see Stoic and he starts talking, and he's talking to young Hiccup in this flashback, it's sad because we know that he is gone, but there's also something, like, comforting about it. Like, it's sort of nice to still sort of feel like he's there, even if in this distant sense. But in Hiccup's case, it's also really daunting, because it shows what basically Hiccup feels he has to become being in this position now. So like there was a lot more strength in having stoic scenes in this movie than I would have ever guessed. But like as soon as he was on screen and as soon as Gerard Butler started talking, it was like it all clicked, and it's like, yeah, I know exactly why they had to do this, why these scenes have to be here. Absolutely, 100%. Yes. And then we introduce yet another villain. A villain with a very cool name, Grimmel the Grizzly, who's voiced by F. Murray Abraham. It just gets better. And he is actually, like I was saying how, you know, Bloodfist maybe would have been a more, like, at least somebody at the height of villainy that Bloodfist was, would make more sense to have him as, like, a finale villain. So yeah, by comparison, Grimmel doesn't seem as threatening, per se, because he's just a dude, pretty much. But he's still this dude that, like, you know, he's a dragon hunter, but on top of that also, what I really like about him is, yeah, he has, you know, people running around doing his dirty work and all that, but for the most part, this is one of those villains that's, like, really, really hands-on. Like, whenever he devises these plans to get Toothless, he's always, like, right there. Like, there's even the point where Hiccup wakes up in his own living space, and Grimmel is just there. And it's like the fact that he's so hands-on and will just go right into it, it does make him a really good and effective villain. And as far as, haven't really been saying much about the dialogue throughout the series, which is another, you know, more or less a strength to it. Something I kind of noticed this time around that I don't know if it's in the other movies, I didn't really notice, the whole gods plural thing, where it's like, where somebody says, you know, well, gods know, whatever, or Hiccup saying, oh my gods, that whole thing. But then there's also stuff like I said, every now and then something will kind of slip through, because, you know, DreamWorks can't always completely get by without doing their whole, you know, I don't know how you would say this, but what I'm getting at is the fact that there's a your mom joke in the dialogue at some point, which I'm not sure. I mean, it is, you know, it's being used as a playful insult, but obviously with the context of it going on, because like I was saying, Snot's whole point in the second movie was all he does is, you know, hit on Ruffnut, and now in this one all he does is hit on Valka, and it's, you know, like I said, they're just really doing nothing with these side characters. I mean, Ruffnut gets a little bit of a crucial point towards the end, but really just out of her not being that bright is what causes it. Yeah, and then there is, every now and then there is a really funny line, though, like, how you would never suspect, especially after everything I just said, you would never suspect that there would be a line that takes Stoic's death lightly. But there is a moment that's sort of just perfectly timed, to the point that Hiccup barely even reacts to it, like, he just lets it slide, like, it's whatever. But when Hiccup tries to take over, I think it's Snotlout that says, who died and made you chief? And then it's like an, oh, no. So the fact that they could actually use that and actually find a funny line in it, I actually kind of like. So, if there is one problem at its core, it would have to be, for the most part, I've already said that, you know, Jay Baruchel wouldn't have been my first choice for an animated voice lead, but it's like, he and especially Jonah Hill almost seem like, you know, they're bored in the recording booth at this point. I would say with Baruchel, you could probably defend it and say that maybe it portrays, you know, Hiccup's uncertainty about all the things he's going into. But I just kind of felt like the voice actors weren't near as in it this time around as they were, like, into it as they were the first couple of times around. And you've got Tough Nut being replaced entirely, T.J. Miller being replaced by another actor, which you're not going to hear me complain about. If anything, you know, it's probably better off, because anything's better off without T.J. Miller. But then it does get to a point where, once again, it always comes back to the relationship between Hiccup and Toothless, and in this movie, you kind of get a sense immediately where it's going to go. But the thing is I don't think it really matters if it's predictable, because that's kind of the whole story, is that we've always kind of known it was going to come to this point. Like, if the first movie had just been a standalone movie by itself, this would be the point that it would come to. And I think most people, you know what that is, but like I said, it's the thing about it's the emotion that comes, once it gets there, and the fact that this is something that is not just the movie deciding, oh well, this needs to happen because it needs a bittersweet ending or whatever. This is something that's been building for 3 movies, and like I said, we've known really that this would have to be where Hiccup and Toothless's relationship comes to this point. The thing that I'm more interested in talking about is the epilogue, actually. Without saying too much, basically, I could see this epilogue being seen as like a cop-out, given what comes before it. Like a cop-out happy ending. But I actually feel like it's really, like, I'm glad that it's there. Like, I'm glad the epilogue is here and that we have that sort of payoff to all this. And how, like, yeah, it sets up the one ending, but then it could be seen as not committing to that ending. But honestly, with the way it's executed and just what it is, like, I really can't think of a more perfect ending, honestly, to this entire story. So, yeah, that's how I feel about that. And then there is the whole, sort of, we get a recap end credit sequence where we started the first movie and go forward, and it's really nice and emotional and all that. Like I said, I didn't have the emotional connection to these movies enough for that to be this heart-wrenching thing, but I mean, I feel like this is going to hit fans hard, like the really big fans, the diehard fans. They will probably be absolutely weeping, and, all the power to them. I don't fault them whatsoever. It's like, I could acknowledge it. I was like, man, if I love these movies as much as everybody else, this would be murdering me emotionally. But it still hit, even as somebody that's not, a huge fan, it hits pretty nicely. Like, you can feel all those emotional beats for sure. Hardly none of them feel false. So, yeah, and once again, like, the action's bigger, it's just as exciting, if not more so. I do think the second one reaches a certain peak that the first and third don't quite match, but I do like this quite a bit, more so than I probably would have thought before I revisited the other two. So, yeah, so I'm good with this series. I'm just not, like, totally in love with it or really emotionally invested in it, but yeah, I can certainly admire it for what it is, and I certainly see what people see in it for sure. So that's, I think, how I leave this. So the next thing, also, we're going to do, like, our Oscar stuff and all that, and I'm going to try to squeeze out what I'm doing with the What Men Want thing. And then, yeah, the Fighting With My Family thing will be sometime next week, to my understanding. So, yeah, as we pretty much wrap everything, most things up as February ends, we'll see what happens after that. So until all of that, that's it.